Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss essential topics about the art and culture of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. So I finally got an intro. Did you guys like it? I want to say I'm well aware the harpsichord use in that intro is very Baroque rather than Renaissance, but I think it's important to know that harpsichords were instruments used during the Renaissance period, but I'm not really the expert by any stretch of the imagination in Renaissance music. The only thing I know about is Palestrina, and I can't actually tell you anything interesting about that. So, anyway, andiamo avanti, it means forward, right? Let's move forward. And we have a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about today. Since in the last episode we discussed painting in a more general sense, for this episode on sculpture, I wanted to use one specific artist and one specific sculpture. Does anyone else do that? I do that all the time. Sculpture. I can't seem to get that right, even though I talk about this stuff all the time. Using one specific sculpture and sculptor, Donatello, to emphasize how sculpture changed in the Renaissance and how it was pioneered, and particularly what made it special. And maybe not special. Special is probably not the word. What made it different or unique, or how it was innovative. Now, the work I'm talking about is none other than his famous Bronze David, the first freestanding sculpture in the round nude since antiquity. I want to talk about this sculpture in a way that I would maybe talk about any piece of art when doing scholarly research. I'd like to look at the artist's background, meaning a brief, and I mean very brief biography for you guys. And then I'd like to consider the sources around the work. Mostly everything that I'm speaking on comes from a contemporary scholarly source or book or article or something of the sort. And also looking at writings from his period. We're going to talk about a really important figure named Giorgio Vasari, right? And also, most importantly, is the visual analysis. Just looking at the sculpture, which I urge you guys to of course, have this image on hand, to look it up on your phone while you listen, get an idea of it in your head so we can look over the details of it together. Try to keep in mind that Donatello did indeed do more than one David. He has a very important sculpture made in marble, his marble David. We're talking today about his bronze David from the middle of the 1400s, the Quattrocento, but its date isn't certain, so we're in between the 1440s and 1460 as to when the work was actually completed. So when you're doing your search to find the work, make sure it's Donatello Bronze David. So Donatello is one of the most important and prominent artists of the early Renaissance. His full name, it's a bit of a mouthful, is going to be Donato di Niccolò di Betto Bardi, but we'll just call him Donatello because Everyone else does, and that's a bit of a mess of a name, politely. Okay. He was born in Florence around 1380. We don't know for certain. And he also died in Florence by 1466, meaning the Bronze David is going to be one of the works done towards the end of his life and career. Okay. Donatello worked in Rome. He worked in Padua, or Padua. How do we say that in English? Padua. Padova. And, of course, in Florence, where he got a lot of patronage from the Medici family. Keep in mind, in this period, Florence is a republic, right? It's a guild republic. We talked about that in the last episode. And so the Medici family are bankers, but in a way, de facto rulers, because they have a great influence over the political system and great influence over the citizens of Florence. And that's why a sculpture like this is very important. And we're going to get to those details. The Medici in question that we have to have on our radar is named Cosimo de' Medici. Now keep in mind, when we get into the 1500s, there's the Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici. This is not who we're talking about, okay? We're talking about the Cosimo de' Medici of the 1400s, the grandfather of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Very important Medici that we will talk about in great detail because he's of course one of my favorites to discuss and to read about and to write about. So we're gonna dive into the structure of the Medici, but not in this episode. I don't think that's essential. What we need to know is about Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Elder, sometimes he's called, who becomes a good friend of Donatello. In fact, when Donatello dies in the 1460s, he's buried right next to Cosimo de' Medici in San Lorenzo in Florence. They were good friends, and Cosimo was a major patron of Donatello. The question of patronage about this David, though, we assume that perhaps Cosimo did commission it, but we don't know for certain, in that the sculpture was a centerpiece in the Medici courtyard. The sculpture also bears symbols of the Medici family, predominantly the laurel, right? If we're saying they're buried in San Lorenzo, Saint Lawrence is among the key saints of the Medici family. The laurel is a symbol of that name. My name is Lawrence, right? I am also in this namesake where the laurel is a key emblem of this name, and the Medici Palace, where the sculpture was, is diagonal to the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence. So these are symbols to the Medici, and the vast majority of commissioned works by the Medici family following this period will have the laurel worked into it somehow to mark the patrons of the work. Okay? But we don't know for sure. There's no documentation that Cosimo de' Medici commissioned this work. Now, while in Florence, Donatello worked in the workshop of who was probably the most renowned bronze sculptor, here we go again, bronze sculptor of the period, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Right, Ghiberti is one of these chief pioneers of what's called the International Gothic style in sculpture. And that's not too essential to our point today, except I think maybe there's traces of it in the Bronze David. We can't call it entirely like ancient in style, right? It's not specifically like a Roman or Etruscan sculpture, right? It's a sculpture of the 1400s. So what influences bear on it? Probably Lorenzo Ghiberti's International Gothic style. We'll look at that as well. And I think Ghiberti is a good topic for a future conversation about Brunelleschi and some of the key players of the 1400s in Florence. What's important to know now is that he was among the best sculptors of bronze in Florence, and that Donatello learned in his workshop. Now, in the Quattrocento, it was extremely common to depict biblical scenes. So the David that we're looking at here is none other than the son of Jesse, the David who slays the giant Goliath. And if you look at the sculpture, he is standing on a head, right? That is the head of Goliath. This story comes from the first book of Samuel, chapter 17. Okay. The David is nude. This is quite remarkable. As I've said, it's the first freestanding full nude since antiquity. And remember, we talked about what Renaissance means, the rebirth of classical antiquity. Donatello is doing a nude sculpture not only in reference to ancient sculpture, to classical sculpture, Roman, Greek, or even Etruscan, which we didn't talk about in too much detail, but also the biblical verse that indicates that in the book of Samuel, that Saul gives his armor and sword to David, who is only a shepherd. And when David goes to approach the Goliath, he can't really move in the armor, so he takes it off. Donatello is interpreting this, that he takes off everything and even his clothing, which probably isn't what the Bible is indicating here. But in reference to this more ancient art form, Donatello very intentionally makes David nude. I'm going to read a passage from the Bible here that explains his appearance a bit. I'm working from the New Oxford Annotated Bible, right? And this is 1 Samuel chapter 17. I'm on line 42. And it says, "When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance." Just a side note, I am not by any means a religious person, but I do recommend that anyone studying or who has general interest in Renaissance art, you should own a Bible, because it really helps to know what a lot of these artists are referencing, even though sometimes they're apocryphal stories or saints' lives, things that aren't in the Bible. But to be able to look and read over what an image might be depicting can help you understand it better. However, we can see that Donatello is depicting this ruddy, handsome youth. The body of this David does not depict a fully grown man. That's just the reality. He is the youngest son of Jesse. He is, I would say, a pubescent boy, I suppose. I don't know. It's kind of awkward to try to identify that with the sculpture, but that is the reality of it. And there is additionally an erotic sense to it. This is not, in this period, a standard image of David. It is sensual. It is even provocative or crude, this type of nudity, which is not always well received by Renaissance audiences. David looks both triumphant and exhausted, that handsome face. And in one of his hands he holds a sword and he tiredly sticks it into the ground. Now this comes from the biblical source, right? David, of course, throws a stone, a slingshot. He uses a slingshot and he hits Goliath in the head with a stone. But he didn't approach him with a sword. He, of course, grabs Goliath's sword. I have the Bible here. It says, "Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head with it." Isn't that cool? So here in Donatello's bronze, David has already done that. He has cut off his head. He's put his foot triumphantly on the head. And note he's wearing a sandal. Okay? I've got something to say about that sandal. But the sword goes into the ground, and he kind of slumps. What about that sandal? What's it doing? I always find it to be troubling. Why is he wearing a helmet, a laurel kind of wreath on his helmet, and a sandal? In the way he's standing, the feathers on the helmet of Goliath press up against his leg, right? And that feather is cutting a strong diagonal, interrupting the space in between David's legs, right? And we have to keep in mind, in the Renaissance, composition is everything. These artists are very deliberately using devices like this to direct the viewer's eye. You are meant to engage with this sharp diagonal. It's got a little bit of a bend to it. Maybe it's not so sharp, but this diagonal line that trickles up his leg and brings you right to his midsection. Donatello is asking you to engage with the sensuality of this young, handsome, triumphant male figure. And that's not all. His hand goes to his hip, and what is he holding? Stones for his slingshot. Now, I've heard an interesting theory about this, and I don't know if I am 100% on board, but I'm gonna shout it out to y'all anyway, and we're gonna see what you think about it by the end of this. In his left hand, poised on his hip, he has the stones. And in his right hand, look at that wrist. Look at the curve of that wrist. Look how it delicately handles the hilt of that sword, right? And look at the shaft-like, this is getting a little uncomfortable. Look at the shaft-like quality and the bulbous kind of tip of the hilt of the sword to have a very phallic sense. That if you were to combine the image of the phallus being delicately handled on one side with the loose, tender kind of fondling of the stones in the other, you have a complete male genital anatomy. And that Donatello is expressing his homoerotic tendencies, right? We believe very confidently that Donatello was gay, that he's expressing that through this, not at the behest of his patron, but through his own artistic endeavor. To drill this point in even more, if you can find a detail of Goliath's helmet, you'll see what has been identified as the chariot of Eros. Eros being another word for Cupid, or the deity of erotic love, Eros, right? What is this doing on Goliath's helmet? Beautiful people, the plot is thickening. As we discussed, Plato was making a resurgence in Florence in this period, and it can be argued that Donatello was referencing a work by Plato called the Symposium. We can read this in this sculpture in two different ways. One, which links to what we've been talking about, the Symposium comes to the conclusion that the premier, or the most heightened form of Eros, is between an older man and a younger man. Right? This is the Greek love. So this reinforces the homoerotic elements of this sculpture, right? This reinforces what Donatello was trying to demonstrate through the resurgence of Platonic thought in Florentine culture in the period. Now also, we talked about that feather. What is that feather doing? Besides pointing us to David's penis, pardon me, the head of Goliath with the feathers shows a type of, it brings to mind the figure of Father Time that would have been not terribly uncommon in the period. And this is showing the triumph of love over time and death. And I think it can be a bit of both, right? Why can't it be the triumph of homoerotic love over time and death? The triumph of Platonic love over time and death? Anything like that. It seems Donatello has given us a very intricate work to ponder. That this isn't in fact David, but it's Eros. That this isn't Goliath, but rather Time, Father Time, beheaded by the sigil of erotic love. Isn't that cool? The sculpture's in a museum in Florence called the Bargello. And I'm going to get to how it moved around, but I want to tell a really funny story. I was in the Bargello with students. I was in front of this sculpture. I was telling them everything that I've just told you. It's a little bit easier when you're standing in front of the sculpture because then you can point to things. And it's a very accessible sculpture. People tend to be very annoying in museums. That's my line of thought. Because they think they own the space. And they can just step in front of you, bump you out of the way. Well, I'll never forget this lummox of a man who had probably read a Wikipedia article or something of the sort on this sculpture, or Rick Steves' Florence travel guide that probably had a 3-second blurb about Donatello's David. I don't know. But he walked up with one person with his teeth out. You know that? The people who kind of with their teeth out. They give you a bad impression. And I'll never forget, the first thing he says, he goes, "This is Donatello's David. Just look at that homoerotic feather." That's what he said. I'm here to tell you guys, don't say that. Feathers are not homoerotic, right? There's something, a feather pointing to genitals can be erotic, but it's only homoerotic if you have the other elements to this sculpture. If I knew that man's name, I would advise against taking any Florence tours from him. So, we have a David and Goliath, or a triumph of love over time and death. Probably both, right? That's why studying these types of works is so fun. Because there's so many layers to it. For my students in the room, one really important term to take from this is contrapposto, counterpoise. This is a sculpture in contrapposto. And once you know this word, and once you know what it means, you'll notice that almost every single sculpture from antiquity and from the Renaissance is in contrapposto. That counterpoise, that is where the knee locks forward, the hip shoots back, one leg is straight. If you look around the world, you'll notice that people just stand like that. People don't stand straight or stiff. They always pop their hip back. One knee bends. They might stand on their toes. They might stand flat-footed. But this David is in contrapposto. Look at the Apollo Belvedere in the Vatican, that ancient sculpture. Look at Michelangelo's David. Look at any sculpture that comes to mind. The previous David by Donatello. Contrapposto is what we're talking about when we reference that slight step forward, that slight suggestion of both motion and rest. Just depends on how you look at the sculpture, right? This contrapposto happens to have the head of Goliath underneath his foot. Not terribly atypical. This comes back to our discussion of realism and naturalism. Even in sculpture, this isn't exclusive to painting. We want our figures in the Renaissance to start to look more naturalistic. People do not stand straight up, but rather with their hips locked, with their knees bent, right? So Donatello is achieving that in this sculpture. As I said, it's currently in the Bargello Museum in Florence, but it was, and I mentioned this earlier, in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. Why is this important? You can see the courtyard from the street. Even in the Renaissance period, you could see the courtyard from the street. Folks, I'm going to add another layer of interpretation to this figure. Whether or not the Medici commissioned the work, it was in their courtyard. They wanted a David and Goliath David triumphant over Goliath in their courtyard. Why? Right? Art is propaganda. Art shows people how you want them to interpret you if you commissioned the work, especially in the Renaissance. So my belief, many beliefs, is that Cosimo de' Medici, should he have commissioned, if in any case he put the sculpture in his courtyard, he wanted to show the people of Florence, like David, who overthrew the giant of the Philistine ranks, the Medici family stands against tyranny. That the Medici family stands in favor of the people. In this light, we have to ignore or overlook or bypass the triumph of Eros over time angle, because while it was in the Medici courtyard, there was an inscription on it. And I have that here, and I'm going to read for you what the plaque said. It says, "The victor is whoever defends the fatherland. All-powerful God crushes the angry enemy. Behold, a boy overcame the great tyrant. Conquer, O citizens." This sculpture stood in that courtyard as a symbol of Medici support of the Florentine citizen through the reign of Cosimo de' Medici. I say reign as if they actually ruled, but they did, but they didn't have, it wasn't a monarchy. Through the reign of the bank, I suppose, of Cosimo de' Medici, through the reign of the bank of his son Piero the Gouty, Lorenzo the Magnificent's father, and through the period of Lorenzo the Magnificent. After the Magnificent dies and the Medici are expelled from Florence in the 1490s, the Donatello's Bronze David is moved from the courtyard to the square of the Palazzo Vecchio, or the Piazza della Signoria, which is where the Republic meets, like the political building, as a symbol of the Republic's overthrow of the tyrannical Medici. Isn't that ironic? I think it's very ironic. After that, of course, it arrives in the Bargello Museum, where it still is today. I don't know actually if we have a record of when that transition happened. It had to be where the David of Donatello is where the replica of Michelangelo's David is today. So I think it would have been replaced by the original David by Michelangelo. And then when the Bargello switched from being a prison to the museum that it is today, it must have arrived there at some point. However, a lot of what we know today comes from contemporary sources. And we haven't talked about a prominent figure from the Cinquecento, from the 1500s, Giorgio Vasari. Vasari was a writer, a painter. I think he did everything. I think he was an architect. He worked for the Medici when they returned after their expulsion. And he is known, write this down for your art history exam, he is known as the first art historian. We got two major firsts in this episode, right? The first sculpture in the round in the nude since antiquity, and the first art historian. Vasari spent a large portion of his time compiling the lives of the artists of his period and before. So the book that I'm referencing is called The Lives of the Artist, and he wrote this in the 1500s with contemporary accounts of a lot of figures. I don't think he knew anyone who knew Donatello, which is why we have very weird records of Donatello. For example, the very start of his chapter on Donatello indicates that he was born in the year 1303, but that's not right. However, he does a cataloging of their works, and he writes about patronage, and he writes about the impact of their works. So I have an excerpt here that talks about his influence as a sculptor, Donatello's influence as a sculptor in his period, his relationship to Cosimo de' Medici, who would have been admired and loved when the Medici were still of prominence in Florence. Of course, they do get expelled, as I said, but there's a period where they are greatly admired. And, of course, how this relates to our idea of Renaissance and the relationship to antiquity. I'm going to read this from Vasari's Lives of the Artist Donatello. He says, quote, "In short, Donatello was such an artist and so admirable in his every deed that he can be said to have been one of the first among the moderns to render illustrious the art of sculpture and good design by his practice, good judgment, and knowledge. And he deserves even more praise, since in his times the remains of antiquities had not yet been unearthed and seen, except for columns, short pillars marking tombs, and triumphal arches. And it was primarily Donatello who awakened in Cosimo de' Medici the desire to bring such antiquities to Florence, which were and still are in the Medici Palace, all of which were restored by Donatello. Donatello was very generous, kind, and gracious, and more attentive to his friends than he was to himself." That is from The Lives of the Artist, Giorgio Vasari. I will be referencing this book many times moving forward, depending on which artist we're talking about. It is the closest account that we can get to artists from this period, even though some of it is a little grandiose, some of it is inflated. But here, Vasari is giving credit to Donatello for what we talked about in the first episode, the Medici family bringing back from the East, from the fall of Constantinople, this rise of Greek culture, of ancient text, and in this circumstance, ancient art from probably not Constantinople, but Rome and the surrounding areas and areas that were considered ancient Roman. That Donatello awakened this in Cosimo de' Medici, that they were able to bond over this fondness for antiquities, and that is how this became a popular mode in the Renaissance. For those of you who are going to listen to this and then go buy a translation of Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, or if you can read it in Italian, all the better, keep in mind that reading and interpreting Vasari is a difficult process because he is not always telling the truth. And when you get this book, and I do recommend it, I really recommend it, when you start reading some of these stories about these artists, you think, how could he possibly know that? Or he might give some elaborate, hilarious story that probably didn't happen, that might have been hearsay about famous artists, because a lot of these guys were famous in their time, and he wants to fabricate or expose certain stories about them for the popularity of his own writing. That makes these books very entertaining, but not always a go-to source for accurate information in your art historical study. So to conclude, what does looking at this sculpture teach us about general modes of Renaissance sculpture, right? We're talking life-size or larger nude figures. We're talking contrapposto, right? Don't you ever forget that when we're talking about sculpture. Contrapposto. We're talking about layering meaning in a whole new way that perhaps the Middle Ages didn't do so astutely. With, is this David and Goliath? Is this love and eros? Is it homoerotic? Is it pagan by the period's definition? But it's all of those things at once. That's what makes it such a prominent piece. That's what makes it the work of Donatello, even though he really has a large opus to draw from, and perhaps we'll talk about those things later. So we're reconciling antiquity with their contemporary attitudes, and this sculpture shows that. It also shows the device of the artist. Donatello is one of the first to start to integrate his own attitudes, his own thoughts, apart from the patronage. We talked about the painting contracts, how specific they were, but things are changing. Agency is given to the artist. Art for art's sake. Remember, we talked about that didn't exist. We're starting to see that surface here. Donatello is the pioneer of this type of sculpture. And that is why he's one of the 4 Ninja Turtles. And that's my one and only Ninja Turtle joke. It's not going to happen again. So don't count on it. In fact, I'm sick of it, and I'm sick of me for having done that to you guys. And any final major takeaways? Remember Donatello. Remember Quattrocento sculpture. That's what we're dealing with here. It's going to change. It's going to change in the future. And we'll look at that in the future. Remember the Medici family. Cosimo de' Medici. This megalith who brings the ancient world back to his contemporary culture and how that affects the artist. Remember in the 1500s, Giorgio Vasari, who's going to write the lives of the artists and give us a lot of information that we can confirm now, today. Thank you all so much for listening. Please give me the best rating you got. Recommend it to your friends, especially if you're students, especially if you're students and you're studying this stuff and you need this type of information. Feel free to write me with ideas. I think my email is posted with this. Write me with your ideas, things you want to hear about, things you want to talk about. I'm happy to do that. We're going to have some more episodes coming out here very soon and some guests. So stay tuned and arrivederci.